Hi, welcome back to AIM Truthcast. I want to introduce a new series to you and explain it, and then we'll get right into this first edition. We're going to call this significant publications. From time to time, there are significant works that are written or come out in video form or announcements made within the mental health system, within the current neo-Kreplinian paradigm, or what they like to call the biopsychosocial model. And so I want to keep you in tune with that. And so I've created this new series that we can look at these publications that have any significance that we need to be aware of and understand. And so today we start with the potential new DSM. And specifically, this one comes from the American Psychiatric Association. In fact, they just announced this week that the new DSM, likely to be called the DSM-6, will focus on biomarkers. And here is the publication that I'm referencing in Scientific American. Notice the title, Psychiatrists Plan to Overhaul the Mental Health Bible and Change How We Define Disorder. The American Psychiatric Association has announced big upcoming changes to psychiatry's big book of mental disorders, the DSM. Now you may ask, what are those significant changes? Well, you can go through this article and you can see what they're suggesting, but what I want to point out is what grabs your attention, and sadly it's where most people stop reading. Look with me at the first paragraphs. A massive reference book of mental health conditions known as the Bible of Psychiatry is going to change. The fifth and current version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders lists nearly 300 distinct conditions that mental health care providers can diagnose and treat. But this dictionary of disorders has long been a lightning rod for criticism, in particular about the way it classifies mental illnesses, which experts have said is not scientifically valid. And I'll just simply stop there and say, that has been proven over and over again. These constructs are not scientific realities. That's reification. They're not existing in nature. You can look at previous videos I've done to see that. But the article goes on. Today, the DSM publishers, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, announced plans to address these problems by changing how the book works. The future DSM Strategic Committee is proposing that the DSM change its guidance for diagnosis and increase its focus on ostensibly more objective measures of disease, biomarkers that may indicate mental illness. The changes would completely reshape future iterations of the manual. Now, I'm not going to take the time to go on into the rest of the article except to note a couple things. First of all, this is a confession that there are no biomarkers. Not only is there not biology for the construct, but there's no biomarkers to find these constructs. Again, as I pointed out in numerous times in previous videos, the body and the soul always correlate. And so phenomena that occur in our soul, sorrow, anxiety, delusions, false beliefs, lies, on it goes, those are going to show up in the body at some point, because we're not disconnected. God has made us to be souls that are gifted the bodies that we live in under the sun while we have life, and then we go into eternity. And so we can correlate the physical and the spiritual. And if you think about a triangle, what they're doing is they're taking the physical and the spiritual, and they're saying these correlate, and we would agree with that. That's what Scripture tells us, that the mind and the body, the brain and the mind at some point correlate, because the physical and the spiritual are separate entities, but they're not disconnected. That's what dualism teaches. And what they do is they take the evidence of the phenomena, and they put them into a construct. And then they skip the phenomena. They don't care about that anymore. And they go directly to the brain, the body, the gut, chemicals in the body, the nervous system, the genes, the entire genome. And they try to connect these invisible, created, fabricated constructs with the body based on the connection of the soul with the body. It's very deceitful. So they don't know how to address the immaterial nature, and so they skip that, and they create these immaterial constructs that they say somewhere exist in the body, and because there are correlations between the body and the soul, there always are, then somehow we can use that evidence to prove psychiatric theory. As I stated, we're not going to look at this whole article, but I'd want to note one specific section if you continue reading down through it. It notes the absurdity of biomarkers. Number one, again, it shows that there are no biomarkers currently. But second of all, listen to what they say. Including biomarkers is perhaps the most controversial possible change. Scientists haven't yet found a reliable biological signatures that reveal if someone has a particular mental illness. The closest we have come to that is for the Alzheimer's disease. Doctors can now screen people for it with blood tests. The APA's researchers plainly state in the new paper that there are no other established biomarkers for DSM diagnoses, but that they want the manual to be able to incorporate them if and when they become available. Sadly, all that is a confession of wishful thinking. Hey, we know we don't have biomarkers. In fact, we don't even have biology for the constructs, but just in case, we want to make room. And so we want everyone to know that we're focused on biomarkers. We want to make this book scientific. In fact, there's been a suggestion, as they talk about, of changing the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, to the Diagnostic and, quote, Scientific Manual. It's almost laughable. They're admitting that just because there's correlations between phenomena and the body doesn't mean that those statistics prove anything. And so they're confessing there's no biomarkers, but then hopeful. They're telling us their hope rests in scientism. Continuing on in this section, they go on to quote Steve Hyman, who was a very influential psychiatrist and former director of the National Institutes of Mental Health. In fact, they state that here. Steve Hyman, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health and vocal critic of the DSM, doesn't think scientists will ever find biomarkers for the conditions listed in the manual. Part of the reason is that the DSM's disorder categories may not reflect how mental illness actually works. The manual's third edition, DSM-3, published in 1980, drew a border across the landscape of mental illness based on how people's symptoms seem to cluster together. Going into the 1990s, psychiatrists were optimistic that these borders would also show up in the brain scans and genetic research, but that didn't happen. So the DSM constructs, the quote-unquote diagnoses that people receive, they don't reflect how quote-unquote illness works in reality. That is a significant statement here in Scientific America. And it's not just Thomas Insel that has pointed this out. Numerous psychiatrists, including Nasir Ghami and Alan Francis, to name a couple more, have pointed out that there really is not a scientific basis for this quote-unquote book of nostalgia. It's really not a book of nostalgia. It's a taxonomy. It's a group of created categories to cast people into, not things to find within the body. And that is significant. That is really important for us to understand. Well, that wraps up our first significant publication video. Hope it's been a help for you, and I hope you'll look forward to more here in the near future.